welcome to the Games Monster Podcast. My name is David Stansky, and this is part of the Extreme Improv Podcast Network. So, if you haven't listened to the Games Monster Podcast before, it's a regular, and I say that with a slight asterisk of as regular as I can make it, because there's a lot of things I do. Regular video games podcast from me, David Stansky, of Extreme Improv. If you haven't checked out Extreme Improv before, then I encourage you to do so. It's a fantastic comedy show where we perform live improv comedy in front of people at theatres and comedy clubs, but also we do podcasts galore. We do our improvised podcast, the Extreme Improv Podcast Radio Rumble, and then we do interview-style ones on the Extreme Improv Podcast Chat Show, and then we do some which are like tutorials about doing improv, as well as some other subjects like this, the video game one, the Games Monster Podcast, the Super Kick Mania Pro Wrestling Podcast, and the Mega Movie Podcast, with a few more things coming up in the near future. So now I've done all of that plugging business and got that out of the way, and you know that you're going to go over to the Extreme Improv Facebook and YouTube channels and subscribe and click like and all that other goodness. Let's get on with today's show. The PlayStation 1, the PS1, the good old PlayStation. We're going to be talking about the original PlayStation and some of the games that came out on it, and it's interesting speaking about this now because as I'm saying this, it's just been in the news this weekend that the fabled Sony PlayStation that was combined with the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo PlayStation, the Sony Super Nintendo PlayStation hybrid thingy, the original version of the PlayStation collaboration between Nintendo and Sony has just sold at auction. If you don't know what this is, then just to give the very brief backdated story on it. The backstory is that originally Sony wanted to work with Nintendo so that there would be a PlayStation add-on, as it was known as, for the Super Nintendo. There would be something that you'd add to the bottom of your Super Nintendo so that you could play CD-based games. And then this device, as it was seen, was a combined disk drive and Super Nintendo, so you could put the cartridges in the top, and it says PlayStation in it, and it's got Super Nintendo controller ports, and it's just sold for something like £300,000. So like a huge amount of money. I did read on Nintendo Life website, which, you know, I like to quote my sources if I ever remember to, and can do so, that someone had offered over $1 million for it, and they decided to put it to auction, and they probably really regret that now, because they didn't get anywhere near $1 million. They got 300,000, which is a shame for them. So anyway, it went sour between Sony and Nintendo, and Nintendo realised that actually CD games are going to be cheaper and quicker to make, and you can put more info on these CD things, so probably people are going to then make more games for the CD, and Sony's going to get all of the money from the CD game sales, which we didn't think of and we probably regret. So then they decided to partner with Philips, and they literally stabbed Sony in the back on that deal by announcing it the day after Sony had announced the Nintendo PlayStation partnership. And then it created the bitter war where Sony decided to go it alone. I think they first tried to partner with Sega, but it didn't work out. It didn't come to anything, not that it didn't work out, it just didn't happen. And then they released the PlayStation 1. And it's weird, just because there's been the Xbox now for what's going to be the fourth version of the Xbox coming out with the Series X. And we're about to get the fifth version of the PlayStation with the PS5. And yet to me, it always feels like they're somewhat still new kids on the block, that even though they've been around releasing PlayStation since 1994, that the PlayStation brand is still the new kid on the block compared to Nintendo, and even Sega, even though Sega have now had longer where they haven't made consoles than what they actually did make consoles. It feels like that there was the Super Nintendo before the PlayStation, and there was the original NES, the original Nintendo, and so PlayStation coming along was just joining in on the third generation, and it was a 3D generation, which means that they didn't ever really have any games or any characters or things that you associate with those old 2D era pixel art things which have resurged in popularity so much in the last few years. So it always feels like that there's something missing from the PlayStation lineup, the PlayStation brand. There's not the 2D mascot characters, like hand-drawn cartoon characters. It's all 3D Crash-Bandicoots and Spyro the Dragons and Lara Crofts and all this other stuff. And just to give you my personal story with the PlayStation, I didn't originally get a PlayStation. My sister did, and I loved it. I loved it straight away. I've spoken about Resident Evil before, and I'll continue to speak about Resident Evil today. But it's where I first played Resident Evil, which is up there in my top 2 or 3 video game series, maybe at number 1 depending on my mood of the day. And it was also where I discovered Crash Bandicoot and Metal Gear Solid, and I didn't discover Tomb Raider there, but obviously that's where Tomb Raider made its home. I played it first on PC, just in case you're wondering, and then I played the first couple of Tomb Raiders on PC. It was only from Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation that I really was like, okay, I've got to play it on PC, on PlayStation. But anyway, I'll come back to that. I'm jumping ahead. So the PlayStation obviously smashed all sales records at the time for a home console. It beat out the NES because the Super NES and the Mega Drive hadn't come close. They'd somewhat split the market. If there was 80 million NESs sold, and then the Super Nintendo sold, I think, about 60, and the Mega Drive sold about 40 or 50 or something like this. It was like, well, obviously a few more people have, bought both of these overall, but they've kind of split the market compared to the NES, which dominated the market, and the Master System didn't get a look in. But then the PlayStation came along, and the Sega Saturn, I can't remember what it sold, maybe 20 million, maybe 13 million, something like this. Maybe that's the Dreamcast that I'm remembering the figures of there. And the N64 sold about 30 million, which was, again, it'd gone down from 80 million NES to 60 million Super NES to 30 million N64s. And the PlayStation was the big winner here, because the PSOne, I think, sold 100 million, or 110 million, or something like this, some insane number. And one of the reasons why it did so well was because it was easy to create games for. Nintendo lost a lot of the people that were making games for them, partly because the PlayStation offered, I think, better rates for developers to publish games on, so they get more of the profit, bigger piece of the pie, and also just perhaps because Nintendo had really tried to monopolise things. They'd said, no, you've got to make stuff for us, and you can only put out this many games a year. So you'd get where companies like Konami or Capcom were making secondary companies so they could release more games on the NES each year. Because Nintendo had their seal of quality, and it probably made things a bit difficult. Now, unfortunately, it did mean that when PlayStation came along, not that there weren't bad games before this, but there wasn't a worry about seal of quality, and you'd get the first generation of the absolute shovelware, where there was like 1,000 games plus came out on the PS1, and some of them were terrible, some of them were barely games. Like, you'd get like a jigsaw puzzle game with just god-awful graphics, and you'd have this as a PS1 release towards the end of its lifespan. But anyway, let's not talk about all of the bad games, let's talk about some of the good games. So there were so many games, and I remember during the era of the N64 versus the PlayStation, people saying, well, N64, it's quality over quantity, and of course, what people don't really realise when they say about that kind of argument is that the PS1 had both quantity and quality, because I personally prefer the N64, and I prefer the best games on the N64 to me are better than the best games on the PlayStation, but there's really not much in it. I've always had a soft spot for Mario and Donkey Kong and Banjo-Kazooie and all these other things, but if I was never able to play those again, but I just had my PS1 and I could play, I'm just going to say some games that come to the top of my mind. Resident Evil 1, Director's Cut, 2, 3, even Survivor. If I could play Metal Gear Solid and even the VR missions that that came out for it. Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, and then of course all the re-releases of Final Fantasy Anthology and the collections and so on, so you could play Final Fantasy 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6. They didn't put out number 3 for some reason. And then what else? Crash-Bandicoot 1, 2 and 3, and Crash Team Racing, and Spyro the Dragon trilogy, and Tomb Raiders. Like 5 Tomb Raider games came out on the PS1. And it's stuff like this where I think the PlayStation deserves like more credit than it gets. I was never into Gran Turismo or the original Grand Theft Autos, but they were also on the PS1. But there was such a huge quantity of good games, not just a huge quantity of games overall, but huge quantity of really great PS1 games. So if you look at the N64 as the main competitor, we can perhaps talk a little bit about the Sega Saturn as well. But if you look at the PS1 versus the N64, you could be like, yeah, Super Mario 64, amazing 3D platformer. And then you could say, okay, and then there was Banjo-Kazooie, similar type of game, and 2 to 3 years later, Banjo-Tooie. And then along the way you also got Donkey Kong 64. Now that's split across, that I've named at least 3 different franchises to get 4 games there. And of course if you count Conker in there as well, but it diverted from its original plan and was quite different. But only one of those was from Nintendo, the rest were all from Rare, and they deserve special kudos, and I'll do a special episode just about Rare one day. But there was a few big platform games which were really fantastic games. But if I then look at the PS1, I can say, well, Crash Bandicoot, Crash Bandicoot 2, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, and then Spyro the Dragon, and then Year of the Dragonfly, or whatever the ones that came out on the PS1 were. 3 Spyro games, 3 Crash Bandicoot games, that's 6 games. But then add on to it that you'd get Ape Escape, and my mind's slipping a little bit, you'd get Gex 3D and Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko, and Gex 3D was a really good game. That was one of the first games that, like I said, my sister had the PS1 that she got for the PlayStation 1, and I was like, well, this is almost as good as Banjo-Kazooie and Mario 64. Now, people hearing that now in today's modern context will be like, what? But back in the day, people went nuts for Gex 3D. And also, it was brilliant. Stroke of genius, in the UK at least, they had Leslie Phillips from the Carry On films and Doctor films and so on and so forth. This guy who was at least in his 60s or 70s at the time, do the voice for Gex, and he was like, oh, hello, ding dong, time for tubby bye-byes. And it was sung so smooth and tiny bit creepy, but so smooth about him. And he's, I think, about 95 now, so, you know, all the best to Leslie Phillips out there. So anyway, just because I'm not going to remember all of these platform games and all of these other games, I've brought up Metacritic, and I've brought up the list of the most highly rated PS1 games. And I'm going to go through, throw in a few thoughts, tell you all of the games on their top 100 list, and if I played them or not. And I'll speak about some in more detail. But just to finish the thought I was saying, so there was a load of more platform games on the PlayStation than on the N64, if that was like the big genre at the time. And of course, whilst you'd get on the N64, you got GoldenEye, this groundbreaking first-person shooter, followed up a couple of years later by Perfect Dark, and along the way you'd also get Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and there was a trilogy of them. In fact, there may have been 4 of those games, including Rage Wars. And what else was there? There was Quake 64 and Quake 2 and so on and so forth. The N64 really had the PS1 beaten when it came to first-person shooters, which is so ironic because from the very next generation, it was the Xbox that really dominated the first-person shooter genre, and that still is kind of almost like the main genre when it comes to consoles nowadays, that they seem you've got to have a big first-person shooter franchise, and everyone's still trying to play catch-up to Microsoft with Halo in that respect. But anyway, the PS1, it had its share of first-person shooters. It had its version of Quake 2, even though it didn't get a version of Quake 1. It had Doom and Ultimate Doom or Final Doom or what have you. And it had a bunch of others, Duke Nukem 3D and so on and so forth. So it didn't slouch in these areas, and for everything that the N64 had, even if some of the games were slightly better, the PS1 had more. And then I will mention again, because I mentioned about Square earlier, I believe, RPGs, N64 had nothing compared to, and even though some people say, oh, Zelda's an action RPG, if you want turn-based RPGs, then Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, Chrono Trigger, basically anything from Squaresoft and then some other companies. It was like, if you want games that are multiple discs, long games with 3D cutscenes and so on and so forth, the PS1 was your machine. But anyway, let's go through the list of games. So, unbelievably, the highest rated game on the list on Metacritic for the PS1 is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Now, I remember having a little play around with Tony Hawk's and Tony Hawk's 2. Never massively got into them. But it's a funny thing that back in the day, just as there's the, like I say, all of the hype over first-person shooters and things nowadays, back then the hype was on Tony Hawk's games, Pro Skater games, extreme sports games would get like steep slope sliders and 1080 snowboarding and I can't even, like, in Cool Borders, steep slope sliders, that was on the Sega Saturn. I'm trying to remember the name of Cool Borders there. But these would seem like these big hype worthy games. Nowadays they barely even exist, if they do at all. But anyway, so Tony Hawk's 2 I didn't play a lot of. Tekken 3, that was a great game. And there was a trilogy, again, a trilogy of Tekken games came out on the PS1. So you got a lot of, games if you liked Tekken. And this is the thing which I think console makers often overlook and forget. Say you really loved Tekken and you bought a PS1 so you could play Tekken. Are you still going to want to be playing Tekken in 3 years or 5 years' time? No. So what do? You bring out Tekken 2, you bring out Tekken 3. And that way, it's people that like that game feel that, okay, if this is the only game I like, oh well, there's a new Tekken. I get plenty of reasons to keep my machine, not to sell it on the second-hand market. But whereas I said, if you liked Mario 64, once you've done it, you're waiting for Mario 64 2 and it never came out. And this is something a lot of games companies, in particular Nintendo, need to learn. It's okay to do perhaps Mario Kart once a generation, but some of these other things we want more than one a generation. But Tekken 3 was a great game, and when you look at the graphics improvements from Tekken 1, which was a rival to Virtua Fighter, to Tekken 2, it's a big leap up, but to Tekken 3 is an incredible leap in graphics. It's no longer blocky lumps of the shoulders and fists. They actually look shaped like actual real people, and it's amazing, the improvements. Same from Final Fantasy 7 to Final Fantasy 8. The character models suddenly look, for that time, they look like photorealistic real people. Anyway, like I mentioned, Gran Turismo, never really played it. I'd love to actually go back and play it now, just because back then I didn't drive, now I do drive, and if anyone knows me, it's actually took me longer than a lot of people to get my licence, and it wasn't that I failed, I just hadn't tried. But I wasn't into the whole driving sim kind of thing. I was much more of a Mario Kart or Crash Nitro Kart or Crash Team Racing kind of racing fan. Then we got Final Fantasy 9, which I never completed. I didn't ever quite get into Final Fantasy 9. I got onto Disc 2 or 4, but other things, I was at college at the time, I didn't play all the way through it. I'd love to. I've downloaded Final Fantasy 9 for my Switch, but I don't even know if I've started it yet. I was just like, Final Fantasy 9 when it came out on the Switch, downloaded it, haven't played it yet. Will do though. Chrono Cross, again, I never played it, another big RPG. Metal Gear Solid, I've played a bunch of times, and it's amazing that you can complete this in a couple of hours, maybe even quicker if you're a speedrunner. Just because at the time it was like, oh my god, it's such this engrossing, engaging storyline. And I loved the idea that you'd sneak up and hide behind walls and avoid being seen, because it was very different than what you'd normally do on games. I remember at the same time there was Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and it got one section where you're trying to sneak into Hyrule Castle where you're trying to avoid being seen, but this was like the entire game. Metal Gear Solid, trying to not be seen, stealth. It got like an hour or 2 hour or 3 hours of voice acting. Like I say, it's weird when you can complete it in 2 hours, and yet there's 3 hours of voice acting, because you'd skip the hell out of it if it would let you. Gran Turismo 2, again, didn't play it. Street Fighter Alpha 3. I always liked the Street Fighter Alpha games, but to me they were just like a poor follow-up to Street Fighter 2. I didn't get into the characters because there were hardly any characters came back from Street Fighter 2. So I'd always play as Ryu and Ken because I knew them, and every time I play Street Fighter to this day, I'll play as Ryu or Ken because I know their controls. They stay the same on every game, and you defeat whoever, and you feel like, yep, I've just beaten 10 people in this tournament, and now I've completed this next Street Fighter game. So it's great, but Street Fighter became less of an essential game for me by the time of the PlayStation. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, I think I've got it on the Xbox, but I've not played it. Wipeout XL, I tried to get into the Wipeout games, but I'd always crashed. It was just not as fun for me, where you had to learn the tracks as precisely as you can, and perhaps do well on like the first cup or the first tournament, and then it would get too hard for me quite quickly, and there were other games I was playing, so I didn't really stick with them. Vagrant Story, again, a game I got and I never played. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, I've already touched on that series. Final Fantasy VII, I've played that through all the way once, and I've played a long way into it again since on the PSP or PS Vita, whatever I downloaded it on. And it's a great game, and I'm really excited. And I went to EGX last year and I played the demo of the remake, and I'm very excited for that. Don't know if I'll ever have time to play all the way through, however many parts the Final Fantasy VII remake will have, but I do want to dip into that. Medal of Honor, I think I played, couldn't get into it at the time. And it's amazing, when you go back to PSOne first-person shooters, they hadn't worked out the controls. There was the DualShock or the analog controller you could get for the PS1, but they hadn't worked out twin-stick controls for first-person shooters back then. And I remember it's like famous that there was a review for the first game that did get it right, which was Alien Resurrection, but because it was so, no pun intended, alien to people, they were like, what is this? I can't play this, terrible controls. You walk forward with one stick, you face the other way with the other stick, what's going on? And today it's just second nature to everyone who plays these games. Going back and trying to play some of the older ones would be an interesting experiment. Parappa the Rapper, great game, love it, love the characters, and to me was one of, along with Crash-Bandicoot, although obviously later Crash didn't stay exclusive to Sony, to me Crash was one of the Sony Parappa was one of the Sony mascots, and it was great, but I could only get to like level 3 or 4, I think, and I'd find it too hard. And this thing, when you look up years later, it wasn't an easy game for a lot of people to play. There wasn't like the skill that you could learn, and it didn't make a lot of logical sense of when you press the buttons and why you'd be doing well and why you wouldn't be doing well. Obviously some people did learn and crack the code there, but it's an actual thing I've read about, that Parappa didn't have the most logical progress that you'd make in the game. Colony Wars, I think I may have had it, didn't ever play it, or may have tried it once. There was one of these kind of real-time strategy games I had on the PS1. I couldn't get into it. Kind of like the look of it, couldn't get into it. Spyro Year of the Dragon, I don't think I ever played that one. I played Spyro 1 almost to completion, but I don't think I ever 100%ed it. And I played some of Spyro 2, but I don't think I ever got to Year of the Dragon. But once again, I've just downloaded the remake trilogy on my Switch, so I hope to get to that. Tomb Raider, the original Tomb Raider, the thing that started the whole craze. And when you go back, it's amazing that some people aren't really aware of this, because I've spoken to people about, well, girl power was a huge thing in the mid to late 1990s, and from my perspective, the two things that I was always aware with it were, one, the Spice Girls, and two, Lara Croft. She was absolutely huge. She was a video game character, yet she was on the front of newspapers, she was on the front of magazines, and not just gaming magazines, just regular magazines. And there was the whole thing where, even though Tomb Raider 1, which I'm talking about here, had come out for the Sega Saturn first, Tomb Raider was then a big hit, and Sony were like, we want it exclusively. So they got it exclusive, at least on consoles. Like I mentioned earlier, it did come out on the PC. It was exclusive for Tomb Raider 2, Tomb Raider 3, and Tomb Raider for The Last Revelation. And it was a really interesting thing, just that probably, maybe more than so much else, hurt the Sega Saturn. If the Sega Saturn had got Tomb Raider as exclusive, things could have been very different, because Tomb Raider was that big. And now I'm not saying that would have tipped the balance, but maybe the Sega Saturn would have doubled its sales. Maybe the Sega Saturn would have lasted a couple more years if it had Tomb Raider either as an exclusive or just day and date coming out on the Sega Saturn as well as the PS1. But I never completed the original Tomb Raider. I found it really hard. I played it on the PC, and you could save anywhere. Actually, maybe I tell a lie. Sorry, I did complete it. What am I saying? I did complete it on the PS1 when I later tried to play it on that, and you'd have these save crystals where you could only save at certain points. I didn't get on well with that, and I couldn't complete it on the PS1. Did complete it on the PC. Then there's Resident Evil, just about my favourite video game franchise of all time. I can't tell you how many times I've played the original Resident Evil or its director's cut version on the PS1, or like the re-releases of that exact version, not the remake. I absolutely adore that game. It's like the graphics of it to me, what you're walking around in photographs, the camera angles, the things jumping out of you, the music, the atmosphere. And same, like when you play Tomb Raider and Resident Evil, they both have tank controls, and they're good. To me, it's how people move. I walk forward, I walk backwards, I have to turn left or right, and I can sidestep. Now on Resident Evil you couldn't sidestep, but you could on Tomb Raider. But it's how people move. But anyway, what else is there? Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, didn't play. Crash-Bandicoot 3 Warped, loved that game. I felt the Crash-Bandicoot games got better with each one, and by number 3 I thought this is such a good fun game, and I 100% completed it. I 100% completed number 2. Couldn't complete number 1. I found that game too difficult. And it's interesting, again, with the re-releases from a couple of years back, they said, oh yeah, so people found the first game harder. Well, it's because it was harder. Ape Escape I had, but I don't know that I've ever actually played it. I'd love to play it. Should play it. Perhaps download it on the PS3 if I can, and give it a go there. Siphon Filter I couldn't get into. To me, it was like, oh, okay, so this is going to be my Metal Gear Solid fix, and then it wasn't. Metal Gear Solid, that's an example of, they could have done Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PS1, but they didn't. They moved it to the PS2. So that's an example, like I said about, there was only Mario 64 on the N64 generation. There was only Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation generation, because even though they released the VR missions, it wasn't a story-based game. And yeah, to me, I wasn't such a huge fan of it. Dance Dance Revolution, I don't think I ever had on the PS1, or maybe I did, I can't remember. I had a couple of those games along over the years, but never really got into them. Like them in the arcade, don't really like playing them at home. WWF SmackDown 2, Know Your Role. It was alright. I could never get into the SmackDown games after the WWF Warzone and WWF Attitude games, and the companies changed who was making them. I much preferred those games and didn't really get into SmackDown games as much. Didn't think the graphics were better. I felt they took a step back, in fact. Colin McRae Rally 2.0, Godspeed to Colin McRae, because I know he died years ago. But no, I never played that. Madden NFL 2001 I didn't play. Final Fantasy 8 I much preferred to Final Fantasy 7. I love the idea of you draw magic out of the bad guys that you're trying to defeat, and then you can use it against them, or use it against other bad guys later if you just keep drawing magic out. And then there would be a huge aspect of strategy in it, like, right, I'm going to keep drawing magic from this bad guy whilst it's attacking me, and because you're drawing magic from it, you're not attacking it, because you want it to stay alive so you can draw more magic. And I love that aspect of strategy. So you'd be looking out for certain monsters to be able to draw magic from. Also, there was the card game that they introduced on it, Triple Triad, and the Final Fantasy IX card game whatever it was didn't compare to it. They didn't have one on Final Fantasy VII, and I absolutely loved Triple Triad. I wish there was a version just of that game, and I think you can get on the PC or the iPad or something, so you can just play Triple Triad. But I wish there was like how you get Pokemon trading card game RPG on the Game Boy. I wish there was Final Fantasy VIII where you could just run around, meet other players to play Triple Triad, and that's the whole game. That would be brilliant to me. Okay, Wipeout 3, I didn't really play. Final Fantasy Chronicles. So I'm trying to remember, that would have probably been Final Fantasy 4 and 5. And I tried playing both of them, didn't get far into either of them. Tekken 2, great game, like I said. Resident Evil 2, fantastic game. A bit more action based than the original Resident Evil, and you can definitely, for me at least, I can complete Resident Evil 2 quicker than I can complete the original Resident Evil. And yeah, I love it. I usually in my head think that I prefer the first Resident Evil to Resident Evil 2. But then when I get into it, I can just get into Resident Evil 2 a bit more than the first one. Einhander. I think this was... Is this the Final Fantasy beat-em-up game kind of thing? I never had it, so I can't really comment on it. Grandia I never had. NHL 2001 I never had. Not into NFL, American football. Ridge Racer Type 4 I did have. Played quite a bit of it, but didn't finish it, and it's been so many years now that I can't really remember too much to comment. Crash Team Racing, love it. Basically, their take on Diddy Kong Racing, more so than Mario Kart, where there was adventure mode, and you try to collect the 3 coins in a level, and the time, trial trophy. I've literally just re-downloaded this, the Switch version, and you're going to be listening. He's talking about a load of Nintendo stuff on this PlayStation-themed podcast. That's because I like PlayStation, and I love the Switch, just because... Especially nowadays with doing all the improv comedy shows with Extreme Improv and everything else I do in life, I don't have tons of time just to sit at my PlayStation, but I do have a lot of time where if I'm in bed, if I'm on a train, if I've gone somewhere, I can just take my Switch, and there's so many of these old re-releases or updates of old games that I used to like. There's I'm just going to get them for the nostalgia. Probably a sign that I'm getting old, but anyway. Crash Team Racing is a fantastic game. Not as good as either Diddy Kong Racing or Mario Kart, in my opinion. Mario Kart 64 as the contemporary to it, but really good games. Madden NFL 2002, nope. Abe's Exodus, I think I played that all the way through. Again, I wish there'd be a modern game that would do like these rendered 2D graphics, because they looked so fantastic back then. So I don't know why someone doesn't say, well, we could do them nowadays and they would look outstandingly good. Because when you look at the Resident Evil remake compared to the original Resident Evil on the PSOne, the remake absolutely blew it out the water. And they've re-released it since, but imagine if they just made a new game with the 2D rendered backdrops, and they were starting to put it into 4K, or even imagine 8K for the next generation, and it had that level of detail. It would be absolutely incredible. And look at the Resident Evil remake again. I know I'm sidetracking again, as I always do, but look at the Resident Evil remake, because they had the amazing 2D backdrops, which were just videos or photos. It meant that they could put more of the graphical oomph from the GameCube, which it originally came out on, into the character models. So imagine them doing it nowadays. It would, things look very realistic. You would look at video games on the PS4, Xbox One X or whatever, and the graphics look incredibly realistic they can do humans and animals that look really realistic. But imagine if they didn't have to make these huge, gigantic environments for them, that they were just on these incredibly, photorealistic backdrops, and you'd think you're just watching a film. You'd think you're watching real people. Anyway, I come away from that. Abe's Exodus looked great. I love the character Abe, yellow, or whatever it'd say. And then, I can't remember what, silk speak, or whatever it'd say. I can't remember. It's not silk or whatever, something speak. And then, oi, 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 where he'd be channeling some telepathy or something. Great game. I completed that. Never completed Abe's Odyssey all the way through, but Abe's Exodus I did. Loved it. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Then there's Driver. Driver I liked a lot, and it was like the first 3D Grand Theft Auto-like game. So that, to me at the time, was like, wow, this is a really cool game. You get out and go into cars, and you drive about, and you're being chased by the police. I played it a lot, but I didn't get very far in it. I found it too tough a game for me. Spider-Man I never played, and I know that people like that game. I didn't play Tenchu or NBA Live 2001. Silent Hill I did play a lot, and I really liked it, and I've played it a bunch of times. To me, it was never as good as Resident Evil, which is its obvious inspiration and comparison. The graphics weren't as good because it went all 3D, and that was cool. But they only did some cool camera angles, very limited in that. And to me, it was like, well, it's just following you about like in Tomb Raider. Some of the shooting mechanics were a bit funky and goofy. They hadn't quite made it work out until really Resident Evil 4 figured out, okay, so if you're going to be a survival horror game, how can we work out shooting so that your aiming's going to really work with a 3D camera? But anyway, Luna 2 Eternal Blue Complete, have no idea what that is. Alundra I never played. Medal of Honor Underground I never played. Dino Crisis 2 I did, and I got into it and I liked it, but I'd love to play it again because I think it was a lot more like Resident Evil 4 than like Dino Crisis 1 or the early Resident Evils, but this predated Resident Evil 4, so I wouldn't have had the appreciation for it. I didn't like at the time that you'd kill a dinosaur and another one would appear, because you could never feel that you've just cleared an area, which is what I expected from survival horror games at the time. But I'd like to play it again, and I remember that I liked that it went back to 2D backdrops. It was great, great graphics, and yeah, it was a good game, fun game, not the best. Played it once, forgot about it after for a long time. Need for Speed High Stakes, didn't play. Abe's Odyssey I've already mentioned. Roll Cage Stage 2, no idea what that is. Metal Slug X I've now got on some, I've got like a Neo Geo like mini arcade machine thing, and I think I've got probably all of the Metal Slugs on it, but I never played that on the PSOne. FIFA 2001 I played all the way through and I completed, and I really enjoyed that at the time, but I haven't played too many of the FIFA games since, just haven't had time. Xenogears, I think that's from the same company that would later make Xenoblade on the Wii, Wii U and Switch, but I never played that. Knockout Kings 2001, boxing game, didn't play. Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix. Now, I had both the Fear Effect games, and to me it was like, ooh, they're cel-shaded, which was this funky new thing, but they're also Resident Evil and a bit of Final Fantasy. Couldn't get into it. To me, they were a bit more like you walk in a room, you turn left when you should have turned right, and like, what was it, like Dungeon Slayer, Dragon Slayer, or whatever it was. Space Ace is a perfect example, where you press the wrong button, suddenly it's game over, and you have to reload it. And I grew bored of that very, very quickly. Dead or Alive, I don't think I ever played Dead or Alive. That was the one that was famous for the big-bosomed women in it, with real breast physics, so that's a bit of trivia for you back in the day. But I didn't play that beat-em-up game. I think I've played Dead or Alive 3 and maybe some of the others, but I don't think I played it on the original PS1. Dance Dance Revolution, no, didn't play it. Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, it bothers me that I've never really played a Super Puzzle Fighter game. I would love to, but I haven't ever really done it. Bushido Blade, didn't play. PSOne 2, gosh, I don't know how long this list is, it might be more than 100, so I might start skipping through. I never played Final Fantasy Tactics. Breath of Fire 4, nope. Dave Mirror Freestyle BMX, nope. FIFA 2002, I may have done, I can't remember now. Parasite Eve, couldn't get into. That was again going to be Resident Evil / Final Fantasy. And in fact, I played Parasite Eve 2 because they didn't put out Parasite Eve 1 in the UK. But I think eventually I got a import copy, but by that time I didn't really get into it either. I'm just going to skip through what else jumps out of me. Final Fantasy Anthology, I've somewhat already mentioned. And what was that? Anthology and Origins and Collection. So I can't think what all three of those would be. Parasite Eve 2, I just mentioned. Alone in the Dark's New Nightmare. Again, if I loved Resident Evil games, then I got this. but I never got all the way through it. I'd love to go back and try and get all the way through it. What else jumps out? Mega Man, I was never a big fan of the Mega Man games, just because I didn't really play them. Whenever I have tried to play them, they're very challenging, too hard, and I think games should be fun. Now it says Tomb Raider 3. So Tomb Raider 2 I played all the way through on the PC. Tomb Raider 3 is the only game out of a bunch of the early Tomb Raiders which I never completed, because I had it on the PS3. My sister got it for the PC, and our PC wasn't powerful enough to load it properly, so eventually we got it on the PS1, and I think it was, you picked up save crystals, you could save wherever you like, but I found this game a bit too hard and didn't complete it. But then I did complete, because I don't think they're going to come up on this list, I completed The Last Revelation, because I think you could save anywhere. And so with the trial and error aspect to it, I got all the way through The Last Revelation. I then got Tomb Raider Chronicles on the Dreamcast, and I loved that game. It was much shorter, and lots of people weren't as keen on it, but I loved that. What else is on this list? Toy Story Racer, I think I played, but don't really remember it. I think that's something that I kind of played for 2 days, 3 days, maybe even one sitting, completed it, and it's like, yeah, I completed that game, moved on to the next, forgot all about it. Chicken Run, I don't think I had. It's amazing that the game Chicken Run, based on the movie, is on any list of the top-rated PS1 games. But that being said, it's only got 75 rating or whatever, user rating of 6.6. So Metacritic is an interesting thing, especially when you go to some of the older, more legacy games. Legend of Dragoon, never played. There is a second page. I'll just see what comes up if it loads. If not, I'm almost out of time on this recording. Capcom versus SNK Pro. Siphon Filter 3. No, nothing's jumping out here that I should talk about. Time Crisis. There were some fun light gun games on the PS1. Looney Tunes Racing, I've probably played. Can't remember it. You'll see a lot of the type of games I liked. Resident Evil games, platform games, kart races. Crash Bash, never completed that. Got very close, but I think there was one level I just couldn't do. Mini games of Crash Bandicoot. Shame they didn't put that out along with Crash Team Racing on the re-release. Sorry, my voice went weird there. Anything else? RPG Maker. Didn't even know that was a thing. Buster Groove 2. Oh no, I'm thinking of Buster Move 2. I liked Puzzle Bobble games, and then Buster Move 2 on the PS1 was great. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the Philosopher's Stone in this country. That was a great game. I completed that. The Weakest Link, that was garbage, but everyone wanted it at the time. Oh, 007, The World Is Not Enough. I had that on the N64, but I know that there was Tomorrow Never Dies first, where there was like, oh, we've got the next GoldenEye game, and it just wasn't GoldenEye. Alien Resurrection, as I mentioned. I liked that, but the controls were unusual at the time. I had the original Men in Black game on the PS1, and it was like Resident Evil, but you had to jump around and platform on it, and I never completed it. I'd love to go back to it sometime. Anything else here? No. Evil Dead Hail to the King, another really bad game. Tried to get quite far on it. WWF Warzone and Attitude and ECW. Hardcore Revolution and Anarchy Rules were some fun wrestling games, but they got worse after WWF Attitude, and then when they went to the ECW ones. Resident Evil Survivor, first person Resident Evil game, wasn't the greatest. Duke Nukem ones. Simpsons Wrestling, that was such a chart topping game when it came out, but sucked. Mortal Kombat, I had a few of them on there, like Trilogy and stuff like this, and I liked them, but I can't remember how much I put into them. But anyway. Look, I'm rattling through stuff, and I know I rattle through things anyway, because there's literally a minute left of this recording. So I'm going to wrap this one up, because this has been the Games Monster video game podcast, and it is from the Extreme Improv Podcast Network. My name is David Postansky, and I encourage everyone out there, follow Games Monster on Twitter. Follow Extreme Improv on Twitter just by following Extreme Improv. This will upload to YouTube as well, so go find Extreme Improv and you'll be able to find all of our comedy content as well as some of our podcasts like the Super Kick Mania Pro Wrestling podcast. And I promise that I'll try and be back with another Games Monster podcast about all things gaming and some retro stuff and some modern stuff all very soon. So until next time, bye bye!